It's a pleasure to introduce you to today's speaker, who's Dr. Alessandra Pino, who's a food historian, author of a Gothic cookbook, which is a collection of recipes inspired by Gothic tales. She's also a podcaster, so her podcasts are Fear Feasts and A is for Apple. She's an independent scholar, and she also lectures at the University of California, for the University of California, on food history and culture. And when she heard about these Dracula lunchtime bites, she was an enthusiastic volunteer for the second season. So, Alessandra, welcome. Thank you very much for coming, and over to you.
Thank you so much. It's so brilliant to be here. I am going to share my screen. Oh, it's wonderful to be here. What an honor to be asked. I am always delighted to talk about Dracula and food, of course. And just the other day, I was thinking, before we get into the talk, I was actually reflecting on just how great the first opening paragraphs of Dracula by Bram Stoker really are. I was recently in Romania and I went to Bucharest and Brasov and Sibiu, and I went up the Trans-Fagaragan highway. Sorry, I'm just going to try and move forward. There we go. Yes, I was up this, you see, the Trans-Fagaragan highway, which is amazing. It's a long, winding road, and it's where the trees have branches like arms coming down towards you, and the forest is really thick, and it's home to wild bears. Anyway, I know I'm highly impressionable, but on that night I was traveling, and the Carpathian Mountains were in the background, and they were really long and dark and looming, and there was a full moon as well. So it was incredible to see. Uh, you know, uh, Suddenly I was on that first page of the novel, and where we start with Jonathan Harker, and we're on his journey into the unknown, and he's driven by youth and ambition, and he's wanting to do well in his job, just like many enthusiastic solicitors and accountants do in Gothic literature. And he's open to new things. And what newer things are there than food when you visit somewhere different? It's that common denominator of having to eat that connects us all, and yet it also differentiates us simultaneously. So food or consumption really is that unsuspecting entry into people's inner worlds that ultimately unites us, as we all need to eat. Now, there's a description of food on the very first page of Dracula. The paprika hendel at the Hotel Royal. It's very grand for Jonathan. What could possibly go wrong? Him making a note of the ingredients in order to reproduce the recipe at a later date? Who hasn't done that? Him writing a note to his girlfriend Mina about the dish, a sweet gesture that we can all relate to on some level, thinking about someone when we're eating. Would they enjoy this? Must tell them about that ingredient. And this happens right at the start. And it's such an effective way, I think, of drawing the reader in from the very beginning. Now, while food and the Gothic might seem like a bit of a strange combination, it's an important way in which authors create a second voice that evokes tension and suspense and sadness, and sometimes a warm sense of comfort just before the next really bad thing happens. And like the warning signs telling Jonathan Harker not to journey on to the castle, the food was there all along, simmering beneath the surface, drawing us into the darkness and tempting us down a very dangerous path. There is a Gothic food arc or trajectory with regards to consumption, in that the earlier Gothic novels, such as Horace Walpole's The Castle of Otranto or the Anne Radcliffe novels, for example, food doesn't play a major role. In fact, it's practically non-existent, and then becomes more visible in connection to the characters and the plot as the genre develops in time. Now, on a positive note, food has always played a joyous role, the joyous role of bringing people together. When we're sitting around a table, we talk normally, and possibly we do so more freely because of the act of eating. And through nourishing ourselves, we also nurture the relationships that we have with the people we eat. This is a bit tongue-in-cheek. You might recognize a few scenes. They seem like they're having a good time. But on a positive note, food has always played that joyous role. And I suppose this is what Dracula was trying to do with Harker. food can act as an entry point of sorts with people that you know, but also with people that you don't know and you haven't met before. So overall, it's a positive thing to do, preparing food, eating together. But what if eating highlighted the darkness that lives under the apparently healthy veil of normality? Does it always turn out to be such a positive experience that brings joy and merriment? Or can things get a little bit tense sometimes? Whether we realize it or not, and you might a bit more after this talk perhaps, we have our own food rules, and when those food rules are broken, rules that provide a cultural indication of what's appropriate and inappropriate when it comes to eating and serving food, how does that make us feel? How would you feel if someone you were eating with suddenly held their knife at, let's say, a strange angle towards you? Or how would it feel to find a tooth in your soup or an eye in your pie, perhaps? And to understand why this isn't acceptable, we would need to already have an understanding of boundaries, a perception of what's right or wrong when it comes to the food rules that we follow socially. British anthropologist Mary Douglas writes extensively about this in several of her books, but especially in this one. It's called Purity and Danger. So, moving on to vampires. So if you type in vampires and food into Google, like I did, you'll discover that lots of people are worried about what would happen to vampires if they ate human food. There's more than one thread on Reddit. In fact, this is the number one question that comes up. What would happen to vampires if they ate human food? And there are so many answers. And I found myself moved by this a little bit because there are people who care. There are people who are actually worrying about what vampires eat as we speak right now. And normally vampires are seen as monsters. But in this day and age, we really try to humanize the monstrous, don't we? And in some way, we try to justify the evil, or at least to understand it, which is why there are so many stories and films centering around why monsters and evil characters are the way that they are. So if you think about stories like Maleficent or Cruella or Wicked, the Joker, the Grinch, the Descendants, you know, they show us the importance of providing a backstory, and food plays a role in humanizing certain aspects of their monstrosity. And perhaps the presence of food in the story makes it easier to digest some of the evil acts that they might perform as we identify with them through food-related scenes. But in Dracula and Carmilla, for instance, vampires might partake socially to a food gathering, but they wouldn't prepare or eat the food. In more recent vampire stories, for example, Twilight or The Lost Boys, there is food preparation and eating in order to blend in with humans as a form of camouflage. And I suppose that vampires have their own food boundaries and rules. I mentioned Mary Douglas earlier with regards to boundaries, and Roland Barthes also is very helpful when we're analysing texts in this sort of way, because he's written extensively on food and the meaning that he states that the ingestion of food is also the consumption of a system of meaning. So food is able to contain contradictions that speak to us directly through our senses, which is why it's so valuable to analyze it, I think, as a language. For instance, coffee as a symbol considered a stimulant for the nervous system is now associated with relaxation, which really contrasts with its original function. So these categories of contradictory meaning can overlap depending on the cultural context. So food can be that positive element of bonding, as mentioned earlier, but it can also represent what's really dangerous within a community and within a society. And what represents danger for a human might not be dangerous for a vampire, and vice versa. But I do feel that in recent times, when it comes to the monstrous, there's been a real effort to get to know one another more and perhaps be more tolerant of the dark side. Anyway, back to Jonathan Harker's journey. We took a bit of a diversion, but he moves further and further away from the west towards the east and into the territories of the former Ottoman Empire. And we can see too how food gets more pungent and wilder and the strangeness starts turning into superstition. In fact, Jonathan says, I read that every known superstition is gathered into the horseshoe of the Carpathians, as if it were the centre of some sort of imaginative whirlpool. And if so, my stay may be very interesting. And indeed it was. Before he reaches Dracula's castle, he is eating meals on a regular basis, and we see him eating normally with a consistency and frequency, and there's a structure to his meals. But this local cuisine is providing him with large amounts of garlic, and Harker has no idea of the significance of that at this stage. He says, we left in pretty good time and came after nightfall to Klausenberg, and here I stopped for the night at the Hotel Royal. I had for dinner, or rather supper, a chicken done up some way with red pepper, which was very good but thirsty. Mem, get recipe for Mina. I asked the waiter, and he said it was called paprika hendel, and that, as it was a national dish, I should be able to get it anywhere along the Carpathians. Now, paprika plays an important role, as Jonathan Harker tells us. After eating the paprika hendel dish, I did not sleep well, though my bed was comfortable enough, for I had all sorts of queer dreams. There was a dog howling all night under my window, which may have had something to do with it, or it may have been the paprika. Fiction and non-fiction meet in Paprika Hendel. Now, Stoker undertook extensive research on the Carpathian Mountains prior to writing Dracula, and it is entirely possible for one of his sources to be John Paget's travelogue, a British traveller. This was first published in London in 1839, and it was a book entitled Hungary and Transylvania. Now, the fact that both the fictional John Harker and Paget thought the dish so important to merit recording in their journals adds to it being a special dish, I think. And I'm going to read out a passage from the travelogue, and it's about how people gather ingredients for the paprika hendel, and it's rather horrifying, so I hope you enjoy it. 2 minutes afterwards, you will hear signs of a revolution. The cocks and hens are in alarm. One or two of the largest and probably oldest members of their unfortunate little community are seized, their necks wrung, and while yet fluttering, immersed in boiling water. Their coats and skins come off at once. A few unmentionable preparatory operations are rapidly dispatched, probably under the traveller's immediate observation. The wretches are cut into pieces, thrown into a pot with water, butter, flour, cream, and an inordinate quantity of red pepper, or paprika. And very shortly after, a number of bits of fowl are seen swimming in a dish of hot, greasy gravy, quite delightful to think of. Not really, John Paget, but never mind. So at this point, after the very first pages of Dracula, we have participated through the food and maybe also through our own gastric juices. They've been stimulated. Garlic has been brought into our bloodstream, also preparing us for the stomach-churning foul horrors that await. And we have absorbed with Harker the small quantities of what Stoker wants us to perceive as otherness, so that the body, when it is exposed to these alien substances in the bloodstream, reacts by producing its own antidote. Food-wise, a sense of danger is also conveyed by the transition from availability of food before Harker reaches the castle and unavailability of food in Dracula's castle. There is mention of cold food that Jonathan eats alone, obviously. Cold breakfasts are laid out, and they become less and less descriptive as his stay in the castle continues. In the scene where the increasingly nervous Jonathan Harker first encounters Count Dracula, we have this description of Dracula trying and failing to gauge what a normal greeting would look like, and he's unable to regulate his own strength, and something appears off. And the same goes for the food scenes. He's trying to reproduce a behavior that could be considered acceptable, and it's slightly robotic. And this is the passage of when they first meet. So he made no motion of stepping to meet me, but stood like a statue, as though his gesture of welcome had fixed him to stone. The instant, however, that I stepped over the threshold, he moved impulsively forward, and holding out his hand, grasped mine with strength that made me wince, an effect which was not lessened by the fact that it seemed cold as ice, more like the hand of a dead than a living man. Now the vampire, knowing its limits, ingratiates himself with the young lawyer with a quality spread, and he says, I fell to at once on an excellent roast chicken, and this with some cheese and a salad and a bottle of old Tokay, of which I had 2 glasses, was my supper. Now, though Dracula does make sure to have gold table service, and of course he thoroughly enjoys the flourish of taking the cover of the dish off of these cold cuts himself for Harker, an excessive formality which also contributes to a sense of uneasiness, as it feels as though the gesture is due to an overcompensation because of the lack of his participation to the meal. So another thing that impresses Harker is that there's a weirdness about him. It's his linguistic prowess. He's very able. He notices there's something odd about it, and it parallels to the strangeness of him not eating. So there's a weirdness that manifests first through the language of food, through his lack of participation, but also then in the language itself. You wouldn't really invite someone into your home for dinner, invite them to dinner and then sit opposite them and not eat. So this is certainly a food rule that has been broken. Other food rules are broken when the next day he goes into the dining room and breakfast was prepared, but I could not find the Count anywhere. So I breakfasted alone, and it's strange, as I have yet not seen the Count eat or drink. He must be a very peculiar man. Dracula is a text obsessed with the language of food and consumption. And I know I see everything through the lens of food, so maybe I'm biased, but it is a type of eating, the blood sucking mainly, of course. But eating in general is a central activity of the book. It's a fight between food boundaries and different types of eating. Food becomes a sort of weapon, and it's also often aligned with strength, which is both in the mind and the body. So we can have this kind of structured eating that fortifies and strengthens where you would not overindulge. But Dracula, on the other hand, does not consume proper substances such as food or dinner. Instead, he feeds upon human beings by drinking their blood, and he doesn't do it with moderation or through disciplined eating rituals. He is not like Harker, our British man. Instead, the fear is connected to excess and to there being no rules. I call it like the vampire fight club. And in this lies the otherness, because food remains the central ingredient by which we understand ourselves and our relationships with the vampiric other. Food itself is a revenant of sorts, and it tells its own story. And though it is old, as recipes like paprika hendel are, they will always belong to the past. But we can reread them and reinterpret them, and they become new again. And that is what we've tried to do with the Gothic Cookbook. And a Gothic Cookbook is a book that looks at the food in Gothic novels. And I have some really good news, because it will be published again. A new and upgraded edition will come out October next year. I also write for the PPC, which is an academic journal on, and my recent article is on the role of food in literature. My dark food theory was published a few months ago by Palgrave, so I'm delighted about that. I write for Haunted Magazine and Rue Morgue. I've written about spooky fridges, paranormal pizza, exorcism and chefs. So please do keep in touch if you're interested in the darker side of food. And thank you so much for listening.
Thanks, Alessandra. That was terrific. And we got plenty of time for questions, but just before it reminded me of in Bistrica in Romania, there's a recreation of the Golden Crown Hotel where Jonathan Harker stays, so Corona Day Out, and they've recreated the meal he has there, where he says, "I dined on what they call robber steak, bits of bacon, onion, and beef seasoned with red pepper and strung on sticks and roasted over the fire. in the simple style of the London cat's meat. So Jonathan Harker's quite dismissive of it, but actually it was really, really tasty.
Yes.
Um, but what's also interesting is that food in Dracula is something that's now being offered to tourists. Um, anyway, enough about me. We've got plenty of time for questions. Thank you for finishing on time,
I hope I
Alessandra.
was
So,
timely. Yes.
yeah, absolutely. We've got plenty of time. So if anybody has any questions, please feel free to type them into chat and I'll read them out, or just simply unmute yourself and ask away.
In the meantime, while we're waiting, because I recently went to Romania and I was expecting a lot more when it came to the association between Dracula and the region, but actually they're not so keen on that. Vlad is quite an important historical figure for the Romanians and someone they're actually quite proud of, having fought against the Ottomans. So they kind of laud him for his prowess and the fact that he was very able and skilled military man as well. So there are some restaurants, maybe one or two I saw dedicated to Dracula, but not as many as I thought. I was surprised by that.
Yeah, they've long in Romania had a big hang up, as it were, about being associated with vampires and the supernatural.
Yeah.
It's really not what they're very keen on. And they don't like one of
No.
their national heroes being confused with a
No, they
vampire.
don't. I
So they
can
don't
totally
make much of
understand
it.
that. No, I can understand that. Yeah.
Anyway, we've got some questions coming in. So Charlotte asks, is there any book in particular that you love for its food description?
Oh, so many. I can go on and on about it. How long have you got, Charlotte? When it comes to what I'm interested in, though, I am interested in those books that are not known for food and what food tells us in those books. So, for example, when I was writing this book, I picked up, well, The Woman in Black is one of my favorites. And the food, it's not full of food, but there are food references. And I couldn't wait to kind of, because Susan Hill's one of the few authors that I look at and that I write about in the book that are actually still alive, along with Jewel Gomez, who wrote the Gilda stories. So I thought, great, I will speak to Susan Hill and I'll ask her, Susan, I wrote her a message, why did you put in that apple and raisin tart? You know, when Arthur goes off to Eelmarsh House, tell me more about why you chose it. Was it a comforting food? And she said, Ali, I've got no idea. I don't even remember putting that in the novella. And I fell off my chair because I had previously also spoken to Sarah Waters and tried to gauge, her use of food in her novels, another author that I absolutely love, Sarah Waters. And she said, I've never thought about food. I don't remember my food references. I don't have. So that's where the idea of Gothic food for me became quite important and central. The fact that what isn't said, what is food telling us when it's not meant to be telling us anything? Because that's where the real message lies.
Okay, thanks. Now we have another question from Matt, which begins with, have you ever worked with a chef or a restaurant in preparing a menu or meal associated with a Gothic novel? That would be a great event.
Matt, it hasn't happened yet because I am, and I'm proud to be, well, the person who kind of has developed the theory of Gothic food in literature. My work stemmed from the work of Lorna Piatti Farnell, who is based in New Zealand, and she kind of coined the term Gothic food based on 80s films. So that's how I started off, but then I've applied it to literature, and my idea is to do certainly somewhere down the line a menu which is dedicated to Gothic novels. That would be amazing. Certain things do already exist, I think more in the cinema space. But yes, to answer your question, I worked 10 years with Michelin starred chef Giorgio Locatelli in central London.
Okay. Thank you. Kate asks, is there any particular food type which is usually or particularly common in the Gothic? And I suppose I'd add to that, is garlic particularly common in the Gothic?
No, not at all.
Right.
But no, not at all. Yes, in Dracula, and then following on from Dracula, any emulation of wanting to reproduce that, because then that's the symbology of food. It works so wonderfully because once you've used that symbol and it's really kind of imprinted in our cultural memory of what the vampiric means, you can take that symbol and play with it. And many authors have done with different novels and either using garlic or kind of talking about foods related to that or what they can do, or foods functioning as garlic would, but it's not garlic. But no, the foods that I notice are actually comfort foods. They are the ones that are used, things like pies, things like bread, things like tarts, things like in The Woman in White, sweetness, anything which is sugary, because it's lulling us into this false sense of security. And that's what's so fascinating. And then bang comes the horror. And it's more effective because of that, I think.
Okay. Um, Gray has pointed out, remember the woodcut of Vlad the Impaler drinking from a tumbler while looking at his impaled victims?
Yes, very
Quite
famous.
famous image.
Very famous image, very much still remembered in the history of also the Bulgarians and all that area. It's something which children are still taught, and I don't think they fully at that point it becomes such part of their tradition that we're not even thinking about the horror of how that happens. A skull, a real skull. It just becomes a symbol for strength. So that's another great thing that food and consumption does in general, that you don't, even with things that are slightly maybe, let's call them distasteful, they then become a symbol for valor, for honesty, for commitment, or for all these other things. So that's just where food can take us.
Yeah, and Gray's added, Vlad is seen sat at a table with bread and a rabbit on it as well.
Yeah,
Um,
why not?
I've got a comment here from Charlotte, who I
Yes.
guess is another author, who says that I carefully plan all the food that goes into my books. Creating a book menu is the most fun.
Wow, you are one of the few, Charlotte. Well done. Every author I speak to, but that therein lies the beauty of my interest in the research of it, because it's like so subconscious. But now, as food is gaining more popularity, and you see there's a more concerted effort to like um, align characters with what foods they eat, and that's common. And I don't know what genre Charlotte writes in, because in the gothic or the horror or the supernatural, food is a bit of an afterthought. So that's where my research becomes more interesting, I think.
Okay, another comment from Matt. To link to your work to the Derby Dracula, one of the things Hamilton Dean, who produced the first Dracula play in 1924, was set the play before a formal dinner. That's why Dracula is literally dressed for dinner. I'd not realized that. So the reason Dracula presumably is wearing evening dress and everything is he's about to sit down for dinner.
That's amazing. And probably not eat anything.
Yes. Any more questions? We got one that I'm sure you'll like to answer. From Lynn, any lists of events or conferences where we might catch you in person again?
Yes, I am the organizer of I'm bringing darkness to everything I do. I organize the first online food history festival is called Serve It Forth, and I do this with my colleagues Dr. Neil Buttery, Sam Bilton, and Tom Dinas. And we did our first ever edition in October, and I talked about food and death along the River Thames with my colleague Dr. O'Brien. So keep your eye out on my website. It's alessandrapino.com. I always, or Instagram, probably better. I update it more, the same name. So Dr. Alessandra Pino, and you can catch, I put links to all my events. I always will look at, though, the gothic or dark or horrific side of food. If that's appealing to you, then I'll see you there.
Terrific. Right, we're coming up to 1 o'clock, so let's draw things to a close. So, on behalf of everybody, can I say a huge thank you to Alessandra for what was a really, really interesting talk? And can I ask you either to turn on your camera and applaud, or just use the react icon and give a thumbs up or a round of applause? Lots of people saying thank you in the chat.
Thank you, everyone. It was so wonderful to be here. I absolutely love speaking about this, and especially to people who love to listen. So thank you so much. It's lovely to see familiar faces as well. Thank you.